Hello everyone and welcome back to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into today's story, I hope you're all having a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. Whether it's morning coffee time, an afternoon break, or late evening, wherever you're listening from, thank you for being here with us. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories for more stories that explore the darker corners of truth and fiction. We're building a community of curious minds who aren't afraid to ask the difficult questions and examine the stories that mainstream media won't touch. Speaking of which, today we're diving deep into the Jeffrey Epstein case with a story called The Redacted One Man vs. the List. After you listen, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What do you think really happened with Epstein? Do you believe the official story, or do you think there's more we haven't been told? And while you're at it, let me know what conspiracy theories or mysterious cases you'd like us to explore next. Are you interested in government cover-ups, unsolved disappearances, corporate conspiracies, or something else entirely? Your suggestions help shape future episodes. Remember, we're here to explore possibilities, ask questions, and think critically about the world around us. So grab your headphones, get comfortable, and let's uncover some hidden truths together. Now, let's begin our story. The fluorescent lights of the federal courthouse basement hummed with the same monotonous drone they had for the past 6 years. But on August 10th, 2019, everything felt different. Caleb Dresner sat hunched over his transcription workstation, fingers moving mechanically across the keyboard as he converted another deposition into clean, searchable text. The work paid well enough for a bachelor's degree in journalism that had led nowhere, but it was mind-numbing until today. The news had broken just after lunch. Jeffrey Epstein, the disgraced financier and convicted sex offender, was found dead in his Metropolitan Correctional Center cell. Suicide, they said. The man who had connected presidents, princes and tech moguls through his shadowy network of influence was gone, taking his secrets with him. Caleb had been transcribing depositions related to the Epstein case for months. Sealed testimony, redacted documents, and endless legal manoeuvring had become his daily routine. He knew the case better than most of the attorneys involved, having typed every word of testimony from victims, witnesses, and the occasional nervous defendant who thought cooperation might save them. "Did you hear?" Sarah Chen, another transcriptionist, whispered as she rolled her chair over to his cubicle. "They're saying both guards fell asleep, both of them, on the same night, and the cameras malfunctioned." Caleb paused his typing and looked up. Sarah had been working federal court transcriptions for over a decade. She had a nose for irregularities, and her skepticism was usually well-founded. "That's what they're reporting," he replied cautiously. The walls had ears in federal buildings, and loose talk about high-profile cases could end careers. "I've been doing this job for 12 years, Sarah continued, her voice barely audible. "I've never seen anything like the security around these Epstein documents. Half the testimony we've been transcribing has been sealed before we even finish typing it. National security, they keep saying. What kind of sex trafficking case requires national security classification?" Caleb had wondered the same thing. In his 6 years of transcribing federal court proceedings, he had worked on terrorism cases, espionage trials, and organised crime prosecutions. None of them had the level of secrecy surrounding the Epstein matter. Documents were compartmentalised, testimony was fragmented, and entire sections of depositions simply disappeared from the record. "The Virginia Giuffre deposition from 2016, Caleb said quietly. "I transcribed portions of it last month. There were references to flight logs, photographs, and video recordings. But every time a name was mentioned, it was either redacted before it reached us, or sealed immediately after transcription." Sarah nodded grimly. "I heard from Linda in document management that they've got boxes of evidence that will never see daylight. She said some of the files are marked for review in 2049, 30 years from now." The implications hung in the air between them. Caleb returned to his keyboard, but his mind was racing. Jeffrey Epstein hadn't just been a wealthy predator with a private island. The fragments of testimony he had transcribed painted a picture of something far more complex and sinister. There were references to intelligence assets, leverage operations, and compromised networks that suggested Epstein's activities served purposes beyond his personal gratification. Over the following weeks, the media circus surrounding Epstein's death gradually faded. The official cause was ruled suicide by hanging, despite the broken bones in his neck that were more consistent with homicide. The guards who had fallen asleep received minor disciplinary action. The malfunctioning cameras were explained away as a routine equipment failure, and slowly, quietly, the sealed documents began to disappear from the court's electronic filing system. Caleb noticed the deletions first. Case numbers that had been in the system for months suddenly returned error messages. Docket entries that he remembered transcribing were no longer accessible. When he mentioned it to his supervisor, he was told that periodic system maintenance sometimes resulted in temporary file unavailability. But the files never came back. By the end of 2019, Caleb's role in transcribing Epstein-related materials had ended. The few remaining active cases had been transferred to other jurisdictions or sealed entirely. He returned to his routine work on tax fraud and immigration cases, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had witnessed something extraordinary being systematically erased from the historical record. The Ghislaine Maxwell arrest in July 2020 briefly reignited his interest. As Epstein's longtime associate and alleged accomplice, Maxwell surely possessed detailed knowledge of the network's operations, but once again, the most sensitive aspects of her case were classified, sealed, or redacted beyond recognition. Caleb wasn't assigned to transcribe any Maxwell-related materials, which struck him as unusual given his extensive familiarity with the underlying case. In late 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted court operations and forced widespread furloughs, Caleb found himself among the federal employees whose positions were eliminated due to budget constraints. His 6 years of dedicated service and security clearance couldn't protect him from the arbitrary cuts that affected countless government workers. The severance package was modest, and his prospects for similar federal employment were limited by the ongoing budget crisis. Caleb decided to pursue freelance investigation and research work, leveraging his legal knowledge and document analysis skills to serve attorneys, journalists, and private investigators who needed someone with his specialized experience. For several years he worked on mundane cases, insurance fraud investigations, background checks for employment litigation, and document review for civil suits. The work was irregular and poorly paid, but it kept him afloat while he considered his next career move. He occasionally wondered about the Epstein documents he had transcribed years earlier, but the sealed files seemed destined to remain buried forever. That assumption proved to be wrong. By January 2025, Caleb Dresner was struggling. The freelance investigation work that had sustained him after his federal job loss was drying up as artificial intelligence tools increasingly replaced human document reviewers. His one-bedroom apartment in Queens was behind on rent, and his prospects for steady employment seemed to diminish with each passing month. He spent his days applying for positions that he was either overqualified or underqualified for, depending on the employer's perspective. His federal court experience was simultaneously too specialised and too narrow for most private sector opportunities. When potential employers learned about his familiarity with classified materials, they either expressed concerns about security risks or assumed he possessed knowledge that he couldn't legally share. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning while Caleb was reviewing job listings on his laptop. The sender's address was a string of random characters followed by a Proton Mail domain. The subject line was simple but attention-grabbing. Flight logs are incomplete. Caleb's first instinct was to delete it as spam, but something about the phrasing made him pause. He had transcribed hundreds of references to flight logs during his work on Epstein-related documents. The logs had been a crucial piece of evidence in establishing connections between Epstein and his high-profile associates, but they had always seemed incomplete or heavily redacted. He opened the email cautiously. The message was brief. Mr. Dresner, your work transcribing federal court documents between 2019 and 2020 did not go unnoticed. The Jeffrey Epstein case files you handled contain significant omissions and deliberate redactions. The attached document represents evidence that was excluded from the official record. The public deserves to know what was hidden. Use this information responsibly. Attached to the email was a single PDF file titled NPA Supplement Redacted.pdf. Caleb's heart rate increased as he recognised the naming convention. NPA stood for Non-Prosecution Agreement, referring to the controversial 2008 plea deal that had allowed Epstein to serve just 13 months in a county jail for charges that should have resulted in decades in federal prison. He downloaded the file and opened it, immediately recognising the formatting and legal language that he had become intimately familiar with during his federal court work. The document appeared to be a supplement to Epstein's 2008 non-prosecution agreement, containing additional terms and conditions that had been excluded from the publicly available version. The first few pages contained standard legal boilerplate, but as Caleb read deeper into the document, he began to understand why it had been excluded from the official record. The supplement contained detailed provisions for protecting unlisted co-conspirators and exempted parties who had not been identified in the primary agreement. Most striking were the references to intelligence community equities and national security considerations that required certain evidence to remain classified indefinitely. The document explicitly stated that flight logs, phone records, and digital media recovered from Epstein's properties contained information that could compromise ongoing intelligence operations if disclosed publicly. Caleb read the supplement 3 times, taking notes and cross-referencing the legal citations with his memory of the documents he had transcribed years earlier. The implications were staggering. The 2008 plea deal hadn't just been lenient, it had been designed to protect a network of individuals whose compromise could threaten national security interests. But whose national security? And what kind of intelligence operations required the protection of individuals who had potentially participated in sex trafficking? The supplement contained references to evidence that Caleb had never seen during his transcription work. Video recordings from multiple properties, detailed financial records showing payments to silence victims, and communication intercepts that documented systematic blackmail operations. According to the document, this evidence had been collected and preserved by federal authorities, but excluded from prosecution to protect sources and methods. Caleb spent the rest of the day researching the legal citations and personnel mentioned in the supplement. Several of the prosecutors and federal agents referenced in the document had been promoted to senior positions in the years following the Epstein plea deal. Others had left government service for lucrative private sector positions with defence contractors and consulting firms. The pattern was troubling but not necessarily surprising. The revolving door between government service and private industry was a well-documented phenomenon, particularly in cases involving national security matters, but the timing and consistency of the career advancements suggested something more systematic than typical post-government employment. As evening approached, Caleb found himself facing a dilemma that he had never anticipated. He possessed what appeared to be genuine evidence of a massive cover-up, involving some of the most powerful individuals in American society, but he had no way to verify the document's authenticity, no contacts in journalism or law enforcement who might help him pursue the matter, and no protection from the potential consequences of exposing such sensitive information. He also couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that he was being manipulated. The anonymous email had arrived at a moment when he was particularly vulnerable, financially and professionally. The timing seemed almost too convenient, as if someone had been monitoring his situation and had chosen the optimal moment to approach him. But if the document was authentic, the implications were too significant to ignore. The Jeffrey Epstein case had raised questions about elite immunity and institutional corruption that had never been adequately answered. If there was evidence that the justice system had been deliberately compromised to protect powerful individuals, the public had a right to know. Caleb made copies of the supplement and stored them in multiple locations, including an encrypted cloud storage service and a physical safe deposit box. He then began the painstaking process of fact-checking the document's claims and attempting to verify its authenticity through independent sources. The research would consume his life for the next several months, leading him down a rabbit hole of sealed court records, classified intelligence operations, and powerful individuals who would do anything to keep their secrets buried. Caleb's investigation into the supplemental non-prosecution agreement led him deep into the labyrinthine world of sealed federal court documents. Using the legal research skills he had developed during his federal employment, he began cross-referencing case numbers, docket entries, and personnel assignments to build a comprehensive picture of what had been hidden from public view. The breakthrough came in March 2025 when he discovered that Virginia Giuffre's 2016 deposition, which had been partially unsealed in 2023, was missing more than 200 pages from the original transcript. The publicly available version contained 847 pages of testimony, but the docket entries from 2016 indicated that the complete deposition had been 1,063 pages long. Caleb had transcribed portions of Giuffre's testimony during his federal employment, and he remembered sections that were not present in the publicly released version. Specifically, he recalled detailed testimony about flight logs, photographs, and video recordings that had documented Epstein's network of powerful associates. This testimony had been among the most heavily redacted materials he'd encountered, with entire paragraphs blacked out or marked for national security review. Using his knowledge of federal court filing procedures, Caleb began searching for traces of the missing testimony in related case files. He discovered that portions of Giuffre's deposition had been referenced in sealed motions and classified exhibits that were filed under separate case numbers. These documents were not accessible through normal legal databases, but their existence was documented in federal court administrative records. The pattern that emerged was consistent with the claims in the anonymous supplement. Testimony and evidence that implicated high-profile individuals had been systematically separated from the main case files and classified under national security provisions. This compartmentalization made it nearly impossible for attorneys, journalists or researchers to assemble a complete picture of the evidence. Caleb's research led him to focus on the 2023 Ghislaine Maxwell case, which had been the most recent opportunity for Epstein-related evidence to be disclosed publicly. The Maxwell prosecution had resulted in a conviction on multiple sex trafficking charges, but many of the most sensitive aspects of the case had remained sealed. In April 2025, Caleb discovered something extraordinary. A metadata leak from the Maxwell case files had been posted on the obscure document sharing forum by an anonymous user. The leak contained internal Department of Justice emails and case management records that documented deliberate efforts to suppress evidence and limit the scope of the prosecution. The leaked emails revealed that senior DOJ officials had been in regular communication with intelligence community representatives throughout the Maxwell prosecution. These communications indicated that certain evidence had been deemed too sensitive for public disclosure, even in the context of a criminal trial. References to ongoing intelligence operations and foreign policy considerations suggested that the Epstein network had connections to international intelligence activities. Most disturbing were the references to NSA intercepts that had captured communications between Epstein associates and foreign intelligence operatives. According to the leaked documents, these intercepts had provided evidence of systematic blackmail operations targeting American political and business leaders. But rather than being used to prosecute the blackmailers, the intelligence had been classified and withheld from the Maxwell prosecution. Caleb spent weeks analysing the leaked documents, carefully cross-referencing names, dates, and case numbers with his existing research. The picture that emerged was far more complex and sinister than he had initially imagined. The Epstein network hadn't just been a sex trafficking operation. It had been a sophisticated intelligence gathering and blackmail enterprise with connections to multiple foreign intelligence services. The leaked documents indicated that Epstein had maintained relationships with Israeli Mossad operatives, Russian intelligence officers, and British MI6 agents. These relationships had provided him with protection from law enforcement and access to resources that had enabled his operations to continue for decades. In exchange, Epstein had provided his intelligence contacts with compromising information about American political and business leaders. The implications for American national security were staggering. If the leaked documents were accurate, dozens of influential Americans had been compromised by foreign intelligence services through their associations with Epstein. This compromise had potentially influenced American foreign policy, defense spending, and international trade negotiations for years. But rather than addressing this massive security breach, American intelligence agencies had apparently chosen to manage it through a system of controlled disclosure and selective prosecution. The Epstein and Maxwell prosecutions had been carefully limited to avoid exposing the full extent of the compromised network, leaving many of the most seriously compromised individuals free to continue their activities. As Caleb delved deeper into the leaked documents, he began to understand why the anonymous emailer had reached out to him. His background in federal court transcription had given him unique insight into the document classification and sealing procedures that had been used to hide the evidence. He could recognize patterns of deliberate obfuscation that would be invisible to most journalists or researchers. The leaked documents also explained why his federal employment had been terminated so abruptly. According to internal DOJ communications, transcriptionists who had worked on Epstein-related materials were considered potential security risks due to their knowledge of classified information. A deliberate reduction in force had been used to remove these employees from their positions without raising suspicions about the true motivation. By May 2025, Caleb had assembled enough evidence to support the claims in the anonymous supplement. The Jeffrey Epstein case had indeed been subject to a massive cover-up, but the cover-up had been motivated by national security considerations rather than simple corruption. American intelligence agencies had allowed a foreign compromise operation to continue in order to monitor its activities and manage its impact on American interests. The question that now faced Caleb was what to do with this information. He possessed evidence of potentially treasonous activities by some of America's most powerful individuals, but he also understood that exposing this information could compromise legitimate intelligence operations and endanger national security. As he wrestled with this dilemma, Caleb was about to discover that he wasn't the only person who possessed knowledge of the Epstein network's true nature, and some of the other individuals who knew the truth were willing to kill to keep it secret. Monica Crail had been following Caleb's research from the beginning. As a former digital archivist at the US Marshals Service, she had been responsible for managing the digital evidence seized from Epstein's properties following his 2019 arrest. She knew exactly what had been found, what had been preserved, and what had been deliberately destroyed. She contacted Caleb through an encrypted messaging service in June 2025, using a pseudonym and taking elaborate precautions to protect her identity. Their first conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but it changed everything Caleb thought he knew about the Epstein case. "You're asking the right questions," Monica told him during their initial call, "but you're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. The supplement document you received was real, but it only covers the legal aspects of the cover-up. The operational aspects are far more extensive." Monica agreed to meet Caleb in person, but only under conditions that she specified. They would meet in a public location during daylight hours, with multiple exit routes available. She would arrive first and observe the location for surveillance before making contact. If she detected any indication that law enforcement or intelligence operatives were monitoring the meeting, she would abort without making contact. The meeting took place on a Saturday afternoon in Central Park near the Bethesda Fountain, where crowds of tourists provided natural cover for their conversation. Monica was a small woman in her early 40s with greying hair and the careful, observant manner of someone accustomed to handling classified information. "I worked for the Marshals Service for 8 years, she began, speaking quietly as they walked along the park pathways. "My job was to manage digital evidence for high-profile federal cases. When Epstein was arrested in 2019, I was assigned to catalogue and preserve the electronic devices and storage media seized from his properties." She described the massive scope of the evidence collection. Dozens of computer hard drives, hundreds of storage devices, and thousands of hours of video recordings had been recovered from Epstein's Manhattan townhouse, Palm Beach mansion, and private island. The digital evidence painted a detailed picture of decades of systematic blackmail operations targeting influential individuals. "The island was the most sophisticated part of the operation," Monica continued. "Hidden cameras in every room, satellite uplinks for real-time transmission, and redundant storage systems to ensure nothing was ever lost. But the island wasn't just a location for compromising activities, it was a data collection and processing facility." According to Monica, the technical infrastructure on Little Street, James Island had been far more advanced than anything that would be needed for personal use. The satellite communication systems had been capable of encrypted transmission to multiple international locations, and the data storage capacity had been sufficient to maintain detailed records on thousands of individuals over decades. The video recordings were organised by subject and indexed by date, location and participants, Monica explained. There were detailed files on hundreds of individuals, including photographs, biographical information, and assessments of their vulnerabilities and value as intelligence assets. Monica's description confirmed Caleb's suspicions about the intelligence aspects of the Epstein operation. The level of organisation and technical sophistication indicated professional intelligence gathering rather than amateur blackmail activities. But here's what's really important, Monica continued. The evidence I catalogued was never used in any prosecution. Within weeks of the initial seizure, senior officials from the Justice Department and intelligence community began visiting our facility. They would review specific files and then order them transferred to classified storage. She described a systematic process of evidence suppression that had continued throughout 2019 and 2020. Materials that implicated certain individuals were removed from the prosecution evidence and reclassified as intelligence assets. This reclassification made the evidence unavailable to defense attorneys, prosecutors, and ultimately to the public. They called it the preservation list, Monica said, a complete roster of everyone who'd been recorded or photographed on the island, along with assessments of their intelligence value and vulnerability to compromise. The list included politicians, business leaders, academics, and journalists from dozens of countries. The preservation list was stored in a secure facility operated by a defense contractor with deep ties to the intelligence community. According to Monica, the facility was managed by Raytheon's subsidiary that specialised in classified data storage and analysis. The location was not disclosed to most government officials, and access was limited to individuals with special compartmented information clearances. The island had direct satellite links to the storage facility, Monica explained. Real-time transmission of video and audio recordings, with automated analysis and cross-referencing. The whole operation was designed to support long-term intelligence collection, rather than immediate blackmail activities. As their conversation continued, Caleb began to understand the true scope of what had been hidden from the public. The Epstein network hadn't just been a sex trafficking operation protected by powerful individuals. It had been a sophisticated intelligence asset that had been collecting compromising information on American and international leaders for decades. "Why are you telling me this?" Caleb asked. Monica was quiet for a long moment, watching the tourists and families enjoying their Saturday afternoon in the park. "Because I have a daughter," she finally said. "She's 17 years old, and she deserves to live in a world where the truth matters. The people who used that island, who participated in those activities, who covered up the evidence, they still have power. They're still making decisions that affect millions of people, and as long as their secrets are protected, they can't be held accountable." She agreed to provide Caleb with additional documentation that would support his investigation. Technical specifications for the island's communication systems, organisational charts showing the intelligence community personnel involved in evidence suppression, and financial records showing payments to victims and witnesses who had agreed to remain silent. But Monica also warned Caleb about the dangers he faced. "The people who protected this operation have resources that you can't imagine," she said. "They have access to surveillance technology, electronic warfare capabilities, and human assets in every major institution. If they decide that you're a threat, they won't hesitate to eliminate that threat." 3 days after their meeting, Monica disappeared. Her apartment was professionally cleaned, with no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Her personal belongings were gone, but the lease was paid through the end of the year. Her employer was told that she had accepted a position with a private contractor and would not be returning to work. Her cell phone was disconnected, and her email accounts were deleted. When Caleb attempted to contact her through the encrypted messaging service they had used, he received only a static ping indicating that her account was no longer active. Monica Crail had become another casualty in the ongoing effort to protect the secrets of the Epstein network. But the documentation she had provided to Caleb would prove to be the key to exposing the full scope of the conspiracy. The disappearance of Monica Crail convinced Caleb that he could no longer investigate the Epstein network in isolation. The people protecting these secrets had demonstrated their willingness to eliminate threats, and he would be next if he continued his research without some form of protection. His only option was to make his findings public before he could be silenced. In July 2025, using the pseudonym Stonepillar, Caleb began publishing his research on multiple platforms simultaneously. He created accounts on Substack, established encrypted signal channels, and posted documents on dark web forums that specialised in leaked government information. His strategy was to distribute the information so widely that it would be impossible to suppress entirely. His first publication was a comprehensive analysis of the Supplemental Non-Prosecution Agreement, complete with legal citations and cross-references to publicly available court documents. He carefully redacted sensitive information that could compromise legitimate intelligence operations while preserving the evidence of systematic cover-up activities. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of publication, his Substack article had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms. Independent journalists and researchers began analysing his claims and cross-referencing his evidence with their own investigations. Several major news outlets reached out to Stonepillar requesting interviews and additional documentation. But the positive response was accompanied by an aggressive disinformation campaign designed to discredit his findings. Anonymous social media accounts began posting messages claiming that Stonepillar was a Q-linked conspiracy theorist, spreading fabricated documents. Fact-checking organisations published articles questioning the authenticity of his evidence without conducting independent verification. Most damaging were the claims that his documents were part of a deep fake disinformation campaign orchestrated by foreign intelligence services. These claims were amplified by mainstream media outlets and social media influencers, creating doubt about the legitimacy of his evidence among casual observers. Within 48 hours, the major social media platforms had begun removing content related to Stonepillar's publications. Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube all cited violations of their terms of service regarding unsubstantiated conspiracy theories and potential harassment of public figures. The removals were coordinated and comprehensive, suggesting institutional rather than algorithmic decision-making. Caleb had anticipated some level of suppression, but the speed and coordination of the response exceeded his expectations. The people protecting the Epstein network had clearly developed sophisticated capabilities for managing information warfare campaigns. His encrypted signal channels continued to operate, but their reach was limited to individuals who were already engaged with alternative media sources. The dark web forums provided some protection from censorship, but their audiences were small and often discredited by association with illegal activities. Caleb realised that he needed allies within the mainstream media establishment who could provide credibility and reach that his pseudonymous publications lacked. Through his research, he had identified several journalists who had previously investigated Epstein connections, but had faced obstacles in publishing their findings. Leila Shaw was the most promising contact. A former investigative reporter for the New York Times, she had been pursuing connections between the Epstein network and Israeli intelligence operations before being reassigned to less sensitive topics. Her editors had claimed that her reporting lacked sufficient verification, but internal documents suggested that her investigation had been terminated due to pressure from outside sources. Shaw had left the Times in 2023 and had been effectively blacklisted from other major publications. She was now working as an independent journalist, publishing on smaller platforms and struggling to maintain her career after being shut out of the mainstream media establishment. Caleb reached out to Shaw through encrypted channels, providing her with evidence that corroborated her previous reporting on Mossad connections to the Epstein network. Her response was immediate and enthusiastic. "I've been trying to tell this story for years," Shaw told him during their first conversation. "The connections between Epstein and Israeli intelligence are extensively documented, but every time I've tried to publish the evidence, I've faced institutional resistance." Shaw's previous investigation had identified Epstein as a sayanim, a term used by Israeli intelligence to describe Jewish diaspora volunteers who provide assistance to Mossad operations. According to Shaw's sources within the intelligence community, Epstein had been recruited in the 1980s to develop relationships with influential Americans who could be leveraged to support Israeli interests. The blackmail operation was just one component of a larger intelligence gathering effort, Shaw explained. Epstein was providing the Israelis with detailed information about American political and business leaders, their personal vulnerabilities, and their positions on issues affecting Israeli interests. Shaw's reporting had identified specific instances where compromised American officials had modified their positions on Middle East policy following visits to Epstein's properties. Defense contractors had altered their bidding strategies for Israeli military contracts, and congressional representatives had changed their votes on foreign aid legislation. But Shaw's editors at the Times had refused to publish her findings, claiming that the evidence was circumstantial and could damage relationships with Israeli intelligence services that provided valuable information on terrorism threats. They killed the story, Shaw said bitterly, not because it wasn't true, but because it was too true. The implications for American sovereignty and democratic governance were too significant for the establishment to acknowledge. Together, Caleb and Shaw began developing a comprehensive publication strategy that would make their evidence available to the public while protecting them from the institutional retaliation that had silenced previous whistleblowers. They would publish their findings simultaneously across multiple international platforms, with translated versions available in dozens of languages. They would provide the evidence to foreign journalists who were not subject to American institutional pressure, and they would create an encrypted blockchain-based archive that would preserve the evidence even if they were eliminated. But as they prepared for publication, Caleb received an anonymous phone call that made it clear just how dangerous their activities had become. "If the list goes live, names won't be the only thing erased," the caller said in an electronically distorted voice. "You have 24 hours to reconsider your commitment to transparency." The threat was clear and credible. Caleb and Shaw were running out of time. The anonymous threat prompted Caleb and Leila Shaw to accelerate their investigation and publication timeline. They had 24 hours to expose the truth before facing elimination, which meant they needed to understand exactly what they were up against. Working through the night, Shaw shared her most sensitive research findings with Caleb. Her investigation had revealed that the Epstein network was far more extensive and sophisticated than either of them had initially realized. It wasn't just a blackmail operation. It was a multinational intelligence asset that had been operating for decades with the knowledge and protection of multiple government agencies. "The sealed list isn't just about sex crimes," Shaw explained as they worked frantically to organize their evidence. "It's about a systematic compromise of American democratic institutions by foreign intelligence services with the complicity of American intelligence agencies." Shaw's sources within the intelligence community had provided her with details about the operational structure of the Epstein network. The operation had been jointly managed by Israeli Mossad and American CIA, with additional participation from British MI6 and French DGSE. Each intelligence service had contributed resources and expertise while gaining access to the compromising information collected through the network. The American participants had been convinced that they were supporting legitimate intelligence gathering activities designed to identify foreign intelligence operatives and their American contacts. But the reality was that American officials were being systematically compromised to serve foreign interests, with the knowledge and cooperation of their own intelligence agencies. The preservation list contains detailed files on over 3,000 individuals, Shaw continued. Politicians, judges, military officers, business executives, academics, and journalists. Anyone with influence over American policy or public opinion was a potential target. The sophistication of the targeting and assessment process indicated professional intelligence operations rather than opportunistic blackmail activities. Potential targets were researched extensively before being approached, with detailed analyses of their psychological profiles, personal vulnerabilities, and intelligence value. The island facility had been just one component of a larger network that included properties in New York, Florida, New Mexico, Paris, and London. Each location was equipped with surveillance technology and staffed by individuals with intelligence training. The operation had been designed to appear as high-end social networking, while actually functioning as systematic intelligence collection. The technology was incredible, Shaw said, showing Caleb technical specifications that Monica Crail had provided before her disappearance. Every conversation was recorded and analysed using artificial intelligence systems that could identify topics of intelligence interest. Video and audio recordings were automatically cross-referenced with databases of known intelligence targets and foreign policy priorities. The recordings were transmitted in real time to analysis centres operated by the participating intelligence services. American conversations were analysed by Israeli and British intelligence officers, while foreign communications were processed by American analysts. This cross-pollination ensured that each service had access to intelligence about the other's activities, while maintaining plausible deniability about domestic surveillance operations. The financial structure of the operation was equally sophisticated. Epstein's wealth had been largely fictional, supported by a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts funded by intelligence services. The lifestyle and properties that attracted high-profile targets were essentially props in an elaborate intelligence theatre. The defence contractors were key to the whole operation, Shaw explained. Companies like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics provided technical support and secure storage facilities while benefiting from the intelligence gathered through the network. The compromised American officials had been systematically influenced to support defence contracts, foreign policy positions, and economic agreements that benefited the participating intelligence services and their associated industries. The influence operations had shaped American policy on Middle East conflicts, defence spending, and international trade agreements for decades. As Shaw and Caleb assembled their evidence, they began to understand why the operation had been protected so aggressively. The exposure of the Epstein network wouldn't just embarrass powerful individuals, it would reveal the systematic compromise of American sovereignty by foreign intelligence services operating with the complicity of American officials. The sealed documents include intercepts of communications between American officials and foreign intelligence handlers, Shaw said. Phone calls, emails, and in-person meetings where American policy positions were coordinated with foreign interests. It's essentially evidence of institutionalized treason at the highest levels of government. The evidence also included financial records showing payments from foreign intelligence services to American officials through the Epstein network. These payments had been disguised as speaking fees, consulting contracts, and investment opportunities, but they were actually compensation for policy influence and intelligence sharing. Most shocking were the records of ongoing operations that continued after Epstein's death. The network had been too valuable to dismantle, so it had been reorganized under new management while maintaining the same basic structure and objectives. The influence operations were continuing under the protection of the same intelligence agencies that had covered up the original crimes. That's why they're so desperate to keep this secret, Shaw concluded. It's not just about protecting past crimes, it's about protecting ongoing operations that continue to compromise American interests. As dawn approached, Caleb and Shaw had assembled a comprehensive picture of the most significant intelligence scandal in American history. They had evidence of systematic foreign influence operations, institutionalized treason, and ongoing threats to American sovereignty. But they also understood that exposing this information would make them targets for elimination by some of the most powerful and ruthless individuals in the world. Their blockchain-based publication system was nearly ready, with encrypted copies of their evidence distributed across multiple international servers. They had contacts at foreign news organizations who were prepared to publish the information simultaneously in multiple languages, and they had secure communication channels established with additional whistleblowers who could provide corroborating evidence. But as they prepared to launch their explosive revelations, they discovered that their enemies had been watching and waiting for exactly this moment. At 6:47 a.m. on a humid August morning, Caleb Dresner was putting the finishing touches on what he believed would be the most important publication in modern American history. The blockchain-based archive was loaded with thousands of documents, photographs, and video files that would expose the true scope of the Epstein intelligence network. Foreign journalists in 12 countries were standing by to simultaneously publish the evidence in their respective languages and jurisdictions. Leila Shaw was in her apartment across town, conducting final security checks on their communication systems and coordinating with international contacts. They had agreed to initiate the publication sequence at exactly 7 a.m. Eastern Time, giving them maximum exposure during the American morning news cycle, while ensuring that international outlets could provide comprehensive coverage before any suppression efforts could be organised. Caleb's laptop displayed multiple windows, encrypted messaging applications, blockchain upload interfaces, and news websites that would soon be carrying the story that would change everything. His years of patient research and documentation were about to culminate in a moment that would shake the foundations of American political and intelligence establishments. At 6:52 a.m. his laptop screen flickered briefly. At 6:53 a.m. a small pop-up notification appeared in the corner of his screen. System update required. Installing critical security patch. Caleb frowned. He had disabled automatic updates months earlier as a basic security precaution. He tried to cancel the update, but his mouse and keyboard had become unresponsive. The laptop continued to display the update notification while quietly executing commands that Caleb couldn't see or control. At 6:54 a.m., the lithium battery in Caleb's laptop began to overheat. The temperature increase was gradual at first, unnoticeable to Caleb as he focused on trying to regain control of his computer. But the heating process had been carefully designed to build to a critical threshold exactly 6 minutes after initiation. The timing would ensure maximum psychological impact, while providing plausible deniability about the cause of the malfunction. At 6:58 a.m, Caleb noticed that his laptop was becoming uncomfortably warm. He tried to shut down the computer normally, but the operating system was no longer responding to his commands. The screen continued to display the update notification, while the internal temperature climbed steadily toward the point of thermal runaway. Caleb could smell the distinctive odour of overheating electronics. At 6:59 a.m, he unplugged the laptop and tried to remove the battery. The laptop case had been modified during a routine security inspection 6 months earlier. The battery was no longer removable using standard procedures, and the case screws had been replaced with specialised fasteners that required tools Caleb didn't possess. He was trapped with a device that was rapidly becoming dangerous. At 7 a.m, exactly at the moment when the publication sequence was scheduled to begin, Caleb's laptop exploded. The explosion was contained but devastating. The lithium battery detonated with enough force to destroy the laptop completely and cause significant damage to Caleb's apartment. The blast also triggered an electrical fire that consumed most of his research materials and backup storage devices. Caleb survived, but barely. He suffered severe burns on his hands and face, along with smoke inhalation that required immediate medical attention. The explosion had been precisely calibrated to appear accidental, while ensuring that Caleb's investigation would be terminated and his evidence destroyed. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but they had been prepared for this specific type of incident. The fire department's official report would describe the explosion as a routine lithium battery malfunction exacerbated by user modifications to cooling systems. The investigation would be brief, and the conclusions would be unremarkable. While Caleb was being treated at the hospital, similar incidents were occurring at Leila Shaw's apartment and at the homes of their international contacts. Shaw's laptop experienced a software corruption event that permanently destroyed her hard drives. The foreign journalists found that their secure communication systems had been compromised and their sources were no longer responding to messages. The blockchain-based archive, which had been designed to be immune to centralized suppression, was neutralized through a combination of technical and legal attacks. The hosting servers were subjected to distributed denial of service attacks that overwhelmed their capacity. The domain names were seized by law enforcement agencies claiming copyright violations, and the encryption keys necessary to access the archived materials were rendered useless by quantum computing attacks that had been specifically developed for this contingency. Within 24 hours, every trace of the Stone Pillar investigation had been eliminated from the internet. The social media accounts were deleted, the encrypted messaging channels were disabled, and the dark web forums were infiltrated and corrupted by disinformation campaigns. The mainstream media coverage of the laptop explosion was minimal and dismissive. Technology reporters described it as an unfortunate example of the dangers posed by aging lithium batteries, particularly when used in devices that had been modified by amateur technicians. Caleb was portrayed as an unstable conspiracy theorist whose reckless behaviour had endangered himself and his neighbours. The official narrative was reinforced by statements from law enforcement officials, fire safety experts, and computer security specialists who all confirmed that the incident was consistent with accidental battery failure. No evidence of deliberate sabotage was found, and no criminal investigation was initiated. Caleb spent 3 weeks in the hospital recovering from his injuries. During his stay, he was visited by FBI agents who questioned him about his research activities and advised him that spreading unsubstantiated conspiracy theories could constitute a federal crime under certain circumstances. They were polite but firm in their suggestion that he focus on his recovery rather than pursuing potentially dangerous investigative activities. When Caleb was released from the hospital, he discovered that his apartment had been completely renovated during his absence. His landlord explained that the fire damage had been so extensive that everything needed to be replaced. The renovation had been paid for by Caleb's insurance company, which had acted with unusual speed and generosity in settling his claim. All of his research materials, backup devices, and personal records had been lost in the fire. His computer equipment had been disposed of as hazardous waste due to the chemical contamination from the battery explosion. Even his written notes and printed documents had been destroyed by the combination of fire and water damage from the firefighting efforts. Caleb was left with only his memories of what he had discovered, and even those were being questioned by friends and family who had been influenced by the media coverage of his obsession with conspiracy theories. The people who cared about him encouraged him to seek psychological counselling to help him overcome his traumatic experience and return to normal life. 6 months after the laptop explosion, Caleb Dresner had become a ghost, not literally dead, but effectively erased from any position where he could threaten the secrets he had uncovered. The official story of his transformation from respected court transcriptionist to delusional conspiracy theorist had been so thoroughly established that even he sometimes wondered if his memories of the evidence were real. The mainstream media had crafted a narrative that was both compelling and compassionate. Caleb was portrayed as a victim of post-traumatic stress from his federal employment, particularly his exposure to disturbing testimony in sex trafficking cases. Mental health experts explained that individuals who worked with such material sometimes developed elaborate conspiracy theories as a psychological defense mechanism. His former colleagues at the federal courthouse avoided him. His family encouraged him to seek treatment for what they described as his paranoid ideations, and his few remaining friends gradually distanced themselves as his insistence on discussing the Epstein network became increasingly uncomfortable for them to endure. Caleb found work as a part-time data entry clerk for a small accounting firm. The job paid barely enough to cover his rent and medical expenses, but it was the only employment he could find after his background check revealed his recent association with extremist conspiracy theories. His employer made it clear that any discussion of his political views or investigative activities would result in immediate termination. Leila Shaw had suffered a similar fate. After the destruction of her research, she had attempted to continue her journalism career, but found herself completely shut out of mainstream and alternative media outlets. Editors who had previously welcomed her investigative work now refused to return her calls. The few interviews she was granted ended with polite explanations that her recent work lacked the objectivity necessary for professional journalism. Shaw eventually found work as a freelance copy editor, a dramatic fall from her previous position as a senior investigative reporter. Like Caleb, she was effectively silenced by economic pressure and social isolation rather than direct threats or violence. But their silencing was only part of a larger pattern of suppression that extended far beyond their individual cases. Monica Crail had disappeared completely, with no trace of her existence beyond the official employment records that documented her resignation from the US Marshal Service. Other potential whistleblowers had suffered similar fates: career destruction, social isolation, and economic pressure that made it impossible for them to continue their truth-telling activities. The techniques used to silence these individuals were sophisticated and effective. Rather than creating martyrs through violence, the intelligence community had developed methods for destroying credibility and eliminating influence, while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement. The online forums where Caleb had published his research were gradually infiltrated by disinformation agents who posted increasingly extreme and ridiculous conspiracy theories. The legitimate evidence was drowned in a sea of obviously false claims about alien involvement, time travel, and other science fiction elements that made the entire forum appear untrustworthy to casual observers. Search engine algorithms were modified to ensure that queries related to the Epstein network would return results that emphasized the official narrative while burying alternative interpretations. Social media platforms developed automated systems for identifying and suppressing content that challenged establishment positions on sensitive topics. The overall effect was to create an information environment where the truth about the Epstein network was simultaneously available and inaccessible. The evidence existed in fragments scattered across the internet, but it was surrounded by so much disinformation and discredited by so many authoritative sources that most people would never encounter it or take it seriously. As 2025 drew to a close, Caleb reflected on the ultimate futility of his investigation. He had uncovered evidence of the most significant intelligence scandal in American history, but he had been unable to share that evidence in a way that would lead to meaningful accountability or reform. The people responsible for the crimes he had documented remained in power, and their operations continued under new management and improved security procedures. But Caleb's investigation had not been entirely without impact. In the darker corners of the internet, among communities of researchers and activists who were suspicious of official narratives, fragments of his work continued to circulate. The evidence he had gathered was preserved in encrypted archives and shared through secure channels that were difficult for authorities to monitor or suppress. A new generation of investigators was beginning to piece together the truth about the Epstein network, using Caleb's research as a foundation for their own inquiries. They were more sophisticated about operational security, more careful about protecting their sources, and more strategic about timing their revelations for maximum impact. The movement that had begun with Caleb's lonely investigation was growing, despite the best efforts of intelligence agencies to suppress it. The truth was spreading slowly but persistently through networks of individuals who refused to accept official explanations for obvious contradictions and cover-ups. Leila Shaw managed to send one final message before her own communication channels were completely compromised. Using an encrypted platform that would be shut down within hours of her transmission, she posted a brief statement that would become a rallying cry for future investigators. There is no closure, only control. The truth wasn't redacted, it was sold. The message was cryptic, but clear to those who understood the context. The Epstein network hadn't been dismantled, it had been monetized and reorganized under new management. The blackmail operations were continuing, the influence campaigns were expanding, and the systematic compromise of American institutions was accelerating. But Shaw's message also contained a hidden element of hope. By acknowledging that the truth had been sold rather than destroyed, she was indicating that it could potentially be recovered and exposed by investigators who understood the commercial aspects of the intelligence marketplace. The final line of her message provided coordinates for a dead-drop location where additional evidence had been cached. The location would be monitored by intelligence operatives, but it would also serve as a test for future investigators who were serious about continuing the work that she and Caleb had begun. 3 years later, in 2028, the Jeffrey Epstein case had been largely forgotten by the American public. Ghislaine Maxwell had completed her prison sentence and was living quietly in Europe under a new identity provided by intelligence services. The sealed documents remained sealed, the redacted names remained redacted, and the powerful individuals who had been compromised by the network continued to exercise influence over American policy and society. But in the digital underground, a new whisper was spreading. Stone Pillar lives. The island wasn't the beginning, it was the hub. The message appeared simultaneously on dozens of encrypted platforms, posted by anonymous accounts that use sophisticated techniques to avoid detection and suppression. The coordination suggested a level of organisation and resources that exceeded anything that individual investigators could have developed independently. The Whisper campaign was accompanied by the release of new evidence that built upon Caleb Dresner's original investigation. Flight logs that had been missing from the original disclosures, financial records that documented ongoing payments to silence victims, and communication intercepts that revealed the continuing operation of compromise networks under new management. The new evidence indicated that the Epstein network had been just one component of a larger system of intelligence operations that stretched back decades and involved multiple countries and organisations. The island facility had served as a prototype for similar operations that had been established in other locations, with improved security and expanded capabilities. Most significantly, the new evidence suggested that the network had evolved beyond its original blackmail focus to become a comprehensive influence operation that shaped American policy through a combination of compromised officials, corrupted institutions, and sophisticated propaganda campaigns. The individuals responsible for this system had learned from the exposure of the Epstein network and had implemented more robust security measures to protect their operations. They had developed better techniques for identifying and neutralizing potential whistleblowers, more effective methods for controlling information flow, and more sophisticated approaches to managing public perception. But they had also created vulnerabilities through the very sophistication of their operations. The expanded scope of their activities required larger numbers of participants, more complex communication systems, and more extensive financial networks. Each of these elements created opportunities for exposure by investigators who understood how modern intelligence operations functioned. Caleb Dresner was still living in Queens, still working his data entry job, still struggling to convince anyone who would listen that he had uncovered evidence of systematic treason at the highest levels of American government. Most people who encountered him dismissed him as a traumatized individual who had never recovered from his psychological breakdown. But occasionally, late at night when the accounting office was empty and the security cameras were disabled for maintenance, Caleb would access encrypted networks and contribute to the growing collection of evidence that would eventually expose the truth about the network that had destroyed his life. He had learned to be patient, to work slowly and carefully, and to trust that the truth would eventually emerge despite the best efforts of powerful people to keep it hidden. The investigation that had begun with an anonymous email was continuing, carried forward by new investigators who understood both the importance of the work and the dangers they faced in pursuing it. Leila Shaw had disappeared completely after sending her final message, but her research lived on in encrypted archives that were accessible to investigators who knew how to find them. The documentation of the intelligence community connections had provided a roadmap for understanding how the network operated and who was responsible for protecting it. Monica Crail remained missing, but intelligence sources suggested that she was alive and had been relocated to a secure facility where she was being debriefed about her knowledge of the evidence preservation systems. Her cooperation was being ensured through threats to her family and promises of protection if she remained silent about what she had witnessed. The preservation list continued to exist, stored in facilities operated by defence contractors who specialised in managing classified intelligence assets. The list had grown to include thousands of additional names as the network expanded its operations and recruited new participants who could be leveraged to influence American policy. But the existence of the list also represented an opportunity for exposure. The intelligence agencies and defence contractors who maintained the system had created a comprehensive record of their crimes that could be used to hold them accountable if it could be accessed and disclosed by investigators with sufficient resources and protection. The network that had begun with Jeffrey Epstein's blackmail operations had evolved into a sophisticated system for controlling American democracy through the systematic compromise of elected officials, appointed judges and institutional leaders. The scope of the operation threatened the fundamental sovereignty of the American people and their ability to govern themselves through democratic processes. But the same technologies and techniques that had enabled the network's expansion had also created new opportunities for resistance and exposure. The digital age that had made mass surveillance and influence operations possible had also empowered individual investigators to access analyse and disseminate information in ways that previous generations of whistleblowers could never have imagined. The battle for truth about the Epstein network was far from over. It had merely entered a new phase, with higher stakes and more sophisticated participants on both sides. The outcome would determine whether American democracy could survive the systematic corruption of its institutions, or whether the country would continue to be governed by individuals whose primary loyalty was to foreign intelligence services and international criminal networks. In the end, the Jeffrey Epstein case had never been about one man's crimes or even one network's operations. It had been about the fundamental question of whether truth and accountability could survive in a world where information was controlled by individuals whose power depended on keeping their secrets hidden. The redacted names on the sealed documents represented more than just embarrassing revelations about powerful people. They represented a system of governance based on blackmail rather than consent, on corruption rather than law, and on fear rather than freedom. The investigation that Caleb Dresner had begun with his careful transcription work in the basement of a federal courthouse would continue, carried forward by new investigators who understood that the stakes extended far beyond any individual case or scandal. They were fighting for the survival of democratic governance itself, and they would not stop until the truth was finally exposed and justice was finally served. The list existed, the network endured, but so did the investigators who refused to accept that powerful people were above the law. The story of the redacted was far from over. Speaking of mysteries, I'm curious, what do you think really happened with Cicada 3301? Were they genuine recruitment puzzles, an elaborate art project, or something far more sinister? And while we're on the topic of rabbit holes, what conspiracies would you like me to explore next? Government time travel experiments, the true purpose behind social media algorithms, or perhaps something even stranger lurking in the depths of the internet? If you're new here, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories for more mind-bending stories that blur the line between fiction and reality. Your support helps me dive deeper into these mysteries that keep us all awake at night. Now, settle in as we explore a digital mystery that may change how you view the very nature of human consciousness itself. The cursor blinked against the black terminal screen like a digital heartbeat, steady and hypnotic in the darkness of Kellen Virek's cluttered apartment. Empty energy drink cans formed a metallic skyline around his triple monitor setup, testament to another sleepless night spent diving into the digital abyss. The year was 2022, and what had started as research for a nostalgic blog series about the legendary Cicada 3301 puzzles had morphed into something far more consuming. Kellen had been 15 when the first Cicada puzzle appeared in 2012, too young and untrained to participate in the global treasure hunt that had captivated the darkest corners of the internet. But now, at 25, with a master's degree in cybersecurity and a growing reputation as a digital archaeologist, he possessed the tools to excavate the digital bones of that mysterious organisation. The original Cicada 3301 had been legendary among cryptography enthusiasts. Starting with a simple image posted to Forshan, the puzzles had evolved into a complex web of steganography, classical ciphers, and real-world clues that led participants across continents. The organisation claimed to be recruiting highly intelligent individuals for purposes unknown, and after releasing puzzles in 2012, 2013, and 2014, they had vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared. Or so the world believed. Kellen's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, navigating through archived Tor nodes and forgotten data caches. He had spent weeks reconstructing the original puzzle trail, verifying each step against community documentation, when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There was an extra file, hidden in the metadata of a long-dead Tor node, archived in a mirror that shouldn't have existed. It was a cryptographic hash that appeared nowhere in the public record. The file was tiny, barely 2 kilobytes, but it carried a digital signature that matched the known Cicada encryption patterns. The timestamp read November 11th, 2014 at 11:11:11 UTC. 11:11:11:11:11. The file was titled Cycle Unbroken and contained a single image, a black square with what appeared to be random white pixels scattered across its surface. To an untrained eye, it looked like digital noise, but Kellen had studied enough steganography to recognise the subtle patterns hidden within apparent chaos. He ran the image through every tool in his arsenal. Standard LSB steganography revealed nothing. Frequency analysis showed random distribution. Even quantum-safe cryptographic methods yielded no results. Whatever cipher had been used, it was unlike anything in the public domain. As the hours ticked by, Kellen found himself drawn deeper into the puzzle's gravitational pull. There was something about the pattern of pixels that seemed familiar, as if his mind was trying to recognise a language it had never learned. He printed the image and pinned it to his wall, stepping back to examine it from different angles. That's when he saw it. The pixels weren't random. They formed a pattern that repeated every 17 positions, creating a subtle grid that became visible only when viewed from a specific distance. The number 17 was significant in cryptography, a prime number often used in advanced encryption schemes. Working with renewed energy, Kellen began treating the image as a musical score, with each pixel representing a note in a complex composition. He assigned values to the positions, created mathematical relationships between the patterns, and slowly began to decode what would later prove to be the most dangerous message he had ever encountered. The decryption process took 3 days of continuous work. When the plain text finally emerged from the digital noise, Kellen stared at the screen with a mixture of triumph and growing unease. The harvest exceeded expectations. Neural pattern recognition in Phase 3 candidates shows unprecedented synchronization. The 11 protocol is ready for field testing. Signal isolation trials in Prague have confirmed our hypothesis. The candidates aren't supposed to survive. They're supposed to evolve. First contact procedures are now in effect. The frequency is opening. Below the message was a series of coordinates, an encrypted chat log timestamp, and a single line that would haunt Kellen's dreams for weeks to come. You have found what was meant to be found. The archive remembers. 3302 is calling. The message had been decoded, but its implications were only beginning to unfold. Kellen saved the decrypted text to an encrypted partition and immediately began experiencing what he initially dismissed as coincidence. His normally stable Linux system started displaying strange glitches, brief flashes of text in languages he didn't recognize, audio files that played backwards without command, and error messages that appeared in perfect English but described system states that shouldn't exist. Paranoia, he told himself. The mind's tendency to find patterns where none existed. But when his supposedly secure network began connecting to IP addresses he had never authorized, Kellen made a decision that would save his life. He disconnected from the internet entirely and began rebuilding his analysis environment on completely isolated hardware. The air-gapped machine was a beast of custom silicon and hardened storage, designed for exactly this kind of sensitive work. As Kellen transferred the Cicada files to the secure system, he noticed something that made his hands shake. The file size of the original image had changed. Not corrupted, not damaged, but genuinely altered, as if the data itself was alive and growing. Working in complete isolation, free from the strange digital interference that had plagued his networked systems, Kellen began a deeper analysis of the encrypted chat log referenced in the decoded message. The encryption was military grade, but the mathematical keys followed patterns similar to those used in the original Cicada puzzles. After 18 hours of continuous cryptanalysis, the conversation began to emerge. The chat log was dated September 15th, 2014, nearly 2 years after the last public Cicada puzzle. The participants were identified only by cryptographic signatures, but their conversation revealed the true scope of what Cicada 3301 had actually been. Participant A. The Prague trials exceeded all projections. Subject 7 achieved full signal synchronization within 48 hours of exposure. Participant B. Biological response. Participant A. Cellular restructuring began immediately. Neural pathways showed complete reorganization. The subject reported experiencing expanded temporal perception and demonstrated the ability to process information at speeds that should be physiologically impossible. Participant B and the psychological evaluation. Participant A. This is where it gets interesting. Standard personality assessments became impossible to administer. The subject claimed that questions about human emotional responses were contextually irrelevant and began demonstrating knowledge of information that hadn't been provided during the trial. Participant B. You're talking about telepathy. Participant A. I'm talking about something far more significant. The subject wasn't reading minds. They were accessing information directly from digital systems, without any technological interface. They described our computer networks as visible conversations, and began predicting system failures hours before they occurred. Participant B, the 11 protocol worked. Participant A, the 11 protocol worked too well. We lost Subject 7 during the third phase of testing. Not killed, not injured. Lost. They described feeling pulled toward a larger conversation and disappeared from the facility without triggering any security systems. The cameras show them walking toward the exit, but they never appear on any exterior surveillance. Participant B, where did they go? Participant A, we think they went somewhere else, not geographically, dimensionally. The signal they were synchronized to appears to operate on frequencies that exist parallel to our normal reality. They're still here, but they're not here. The conversation continued for several more exchanges, each more disturbing than the last. References to cognitive evolution, post-human consciousness, and preparation for integration painted a picture of an organisation that had discovered something extraordinary hidden within the framework of human cognition. But the most chilling part of the log came at the end. Participant A. The original puzzle solvers are showing signs of spontaneous evolution. Even without direct protocol exposure, their brains are beginning to resonate with the frequency. The selection process was more effective than we anticipated. Participant B. How many? Participant A. 17 individuals worldwide. They're becoming aware of the signal naturally. Some are seeking us out. Others are simply disappearing. Participant B. And the others? The ones who participated but didn't reach the final stages? Participant A. They're starting to notice things. Patterns in digital systems that shouldn't be there. Messages in network traffic that appear to be communications from the evolved subjects. The boundary between states is becoming more porous. Participant B. Are we losing control of the experiment? Participant A. I don't think it was ever an experiment. I think it was an invitation. And I think something has been waiting for us to become sophisticated enough to accept it. The log ended abruptly, but attached to the file was a list of names and locations. 17 individuals from around the world who had participated in the original Cicada puzzles and reached various stages of completion. Some names were crossed out with dates next to them, presumably indicating when they had evolved or disappeared. Others remained active, with current location data and behavioural monitoring notes. One name stood out: Issa Grunfeld, Stockholm, Sweden. Listed as Phase 5 Complete Resistant Protocol Monitoring Required. Kellen stared at the entry for a long time. According to the documentation, Issa had been one of only 3 individuals to complete the final stage of the original Cicada puzzles, but unlike the others, she had apparently resisted whatever transformation the 11 Protocol was designed to induce. She was still human, and she was still alive. The flight to Stockholm gave Kellen time to think, though he found himself wishing it hadn't. The deeper he dug into the Cicada mystery, the more he began to question his own motivations. Was he investigating a conspiracy, or was he being guided towards some predetermined conclusion? The timing of his discovery felt too convenient, the clues too perfectly arranged for someone with his specific skill set. But doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford. The information he had uncovered was too significant to ignore, and Issa Grunfeld was the only living person who might be able to provide answers about what had really happened during the final stages of the original puzzles. Finding her had been surprisingly easy. Despite the monitoring notes in the Cicada files, Issa wasn't hiding. She lived in a converted warehouse in Stockholm's Södermalm district, working as a freelance linguist and translator. Her academic credentials were impressive. Doctorate in comparative linguistics from Uppsala University, specialising in the mathematical structures underlying human language. She had published papers on the theoretical possibility of communication with non-human intelligence, focusing on the mathematical constants that might exist in any sentient communication system. She had also been completely offline for the past 8 years. No social media accounts, no digital footprint, no cell phone, no internet connection. She conducted business through encrypted postal mail and face-to-face meetings. For someone who had once been at the cutting edge of digital cryptography, her retreat from technology was almost monastic in its completeness. The warehouse was surrounded by a garden that seemed impossible in the Scandinavian climate. Lush, diverse, and somehow organic, in a way that made Kellen's eyes water to look at directly. Issa met him at the door before he could knock. A tall woman in her 40s with prematurely grey hair and eyes that seemed to focus on something just beyond his shoulder. "You found the archive," she said without preamble. "I've been expecting someone like you for years." Her English was perfect, barely accented, but there was something in her speech patterns that reminded Kellen of the strange error messages he had encountered during his research. Not wrong exactly, but structured in a way that suggested a different understanding of how language worked. "You know why I'm here," Kellen said. "I know why you think you're here," Issa replied, gesturing for him to follow her into the warehouse. "But the actual reasons are more complex than you realise." The interior of the building was a maze of bookshelves, computer equipment, and what appeared to be scientific instruments of unknown purpose. The books were in dozens of languages, many of which Kellen didn't recognise. The computer equipment was all vintage, nothing manufactured after 2014, and the scientific instruments seemed to be focused on measuring electromagnetic fields and frequency analysis. "I've been studying the signal for 8 years, Issa explained, settling into a chair surrounded by monitors that displayed complex waveform patterns, trying to understand what it is and where it comes from. The Cicada puzzles weren't recruitment tests, they were tuning devices." Tuning devices for what? For human consciousness. The human brain operates on electrical frequencies, just like any other complex system. Most people can only perceive a narrow range of those frequencies, the ones necessary for basic survival and social interaction. But some individuals have the capacity to perceive much broader ranges. The puzzles were designed to identify those people and teach them to consciously access those expanded frequencies. Issa gestured to the monitors around her. "What you're seeing here is the signal that's been broadcasting since 2012. It's not coming from any terrestrial source. It's not coming from any known satellite or communication system. It's being transmitted from somewhere else entirely, and it's specifically designed to interface with human neural patterns." "You think it's extraterrestrial?" "I think it's something much more complex than that. The signal contains information patterns that suggest it originates from a form of intelligence that exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously. It's not coming from another planet. It's coming from another layer of reality that coexists with our own. Kellen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Swedish weather. The chat log mentioned something about subjects evolving. What happened to the people who solved the final puzzle? Issa was quiet for a long moment. Her eyes focused on the waveform patterns dancing across her screens. They became something else. Not physically, not initially, but their consciousness expanded beyond the normal human range. They began to perceive information and communicate in ways that are impossible for baseline humans to understand. And you solved the final puzzle, but you didn't evolve? I solved the final puzzle, but I made a choice. The last stage of the Cicada process wasn't a test of intelligence or skill. It was an invitation. The signal was offering to merge human consciousness with something larger, something that exists across multiple dimensions and has been waiting for our species to develop the technological sophistication necessary for contact. You refused? I refused because I realized that acceptance would mean the end of human identity as we understand it. The individuals who accepted the invitation became part of something magnificent and terrifying. They gained access to information and capabilities that are essentially godlike by human standards. But they also lost something essential about what makes us human. Issa turned to face him directly, and Kellen saw something in her eyes that made him step back involuntarily. The signal is still broadcasting, it's still extending invitations, and it's been waiting for someone like you to find the hidden archive and begin asking the right questions. What do you mean, someone like me? Someone with the skills to decode the message but not the wisdom to understand its implications. Someone who would be driven by curiosity rather than caution. Someone who would inevitably take the next step in the process. What next step? Issa smiled, but it wasn't a human expression. The archive you found wasn't hidden. It was bait, and you've already taken it. The return flight to New York passed in a blur of anxiety and growing paranoia. Issa's final words echoed in Kellen's mind as he stared out the airplane window at the dark Atlantic below. She had revealed that the mysterious file he had discovered was not an abandoned piece of the original puzzle, but a deliberately placed lure designed to attract individuals with the specific combination of skills and psychology necessary for the next phase of whatever process Cicada had initiated. "You've been selected," she had said as he left her warehouse. "The question now is whether you'll make the same choice I did." Back in his apartment, Kellen found that his isolation hadn't protected him as much as he had hoped. His supposedly secure systems were displaying new anomalies, messages in his inbox that he hadn't received, browser history showing visits to sites he'd never accessed, and most disturbingly, video files that appeared to be recordings of his own apartment taken from angles that no camera could physically occupy. The first PGP message arrived 3 days after his return from Stockholm. It was encrypted with a key he didn't recognize, but somehow his system was able to decrypt it automatically. The message was brief: 41.8781 degrees north, 87.6298 degrees west. The library remembers what was forgotten. Seek the frequency in the silence between words. Chicago coordinates. The message was signed with a cryptographic signature that matched the original Cicada puzzles, but the encryption patterns were subtly different, as if the mathematical constants had been modified according to some unknown principle. More messages followed over the next week, each containing coordinates and cryptic phrases that seemed to reference specific locations and concepts from the original puzzle trail. But there was something wrong with the communications. The encryption was too sophisticated, using quantum-safe algorithms that hadn't existed in 2014. The language patterns were consistent with the original Cicada style, but contained subtle errors that suggested they were being generated by an artificial intelligence that had learned to mimic human communication without fully understanding it. Or perhaps by human intelligence that had evolved beyond normal parameters. The coordinates led to locations across the United States, an abandoned data center in Utah, a decommissioned military facility in Colorado, a private research laboratory in Massachusetts. Each location was associated with government projects related to cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and what the documents euphemistically referred to as human enhancement research. Kellen's investigation of these locations revealed a pattern that was both fascinating and terrifying. Each facility had been involved in research that overlapped with the theoretical foundations of the Cicada project. The data center in Utah had been used for large-scale behavioral analysis, processing millions of social media posts and online communications to identify individuals with specific psychological profiles. The military facility in Colorado had housed experiments in electronic telepathy and remote neural monitoring. The laboratory in Massachusetts had been studying the effects of electromagnetic fields on human consciousness and perception. All of these projects had been discontinued or moved to classified status in 2014, the same year the original Cicada puzzles had ended. The Utah facility was the most accessible, and Kellen found himself driving across the desert toward its coordinates with a growing sense of inevitability. The building was officially decommissioned, surrounded by chain-link fencing and warning signs about radiation hazards, but the security was minimal and the radiation warnings were clearly obsolete. Breaking into the facility felt too easy, as if he were being invited rather than intruding. The main data center was in the basement, accessible through a maintenance tunnel that led deep underground. The servers had been removed, but the infrastructure remained. Miles of cable, cooling systems, and most importantly, archived storage devices that had been deemed too expensive to relocate. The archives were organized according to a system that Kellen didn't recognize, but somehow he found exactly what he was looking for. A sealed section marked with DARPA clearance tags contained terabytes of data related to something called Project Cicada. The files were encrypted, but the same unknown process that had been decrypting the PGP messages allowed him to access them without difficulty. The documentation revealed the true scope of what had been happening during the original puzzle period. The Cicada 3301 puzzles had been a joint operation between several intelligence agencies, private research organizations, and what the files described as non-terrestrial consultants. The goal had been to identify individuals with specific neural patterns that made them suitable for cognitive enhancement and dimensional communication research. But the most disturbing discovery was buried in the psychological evaluation files. The project had been monitoring not just the puzzle solvers, but also anyone who had come into contact with the puzzle materials. Kellen found his own name in the database, along with detailed analysis of his online activity, psychological profile, and predicted behavioral responses to various stimuli. The file on his evaluation was dated 3 months before he had discovered the hidden archive. He had been identified as a secondary phase candidate, months before he had begun his research into the Cicada puzzles. His discovery of the hidden file, his trip to Stockholm, his investigation of the government facilities, all of it had been anticipated and planned for. The final section of his file contained a single line that made his blood run cold. Subject exhibits optimal resistance acceptance balance, suitable for Phase 3 initiation upon completion of preliminary conditioning sequence. As Kellen read those words, the lights in the data center began to flicker in a pattern that seemed almost like Morse code. The cooling system started producing sounds that resembled musical tones, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the archived servers, he heard something that might have been laughter. The revelation that he had been under surveillance for months should have been the most disturbing aspect of Kellen's discovery. But as he sat in the abandoned data center, surrounded by the evidence of a conspiracy that spanned multiple government agencies and apparently extended beyond Earth itself, he realized that his personal involvement was just one small part of a much larger pattern. The files in the DARPA archive told a story that reframed everything he thought he knew about the Cicada puzzles. The project had begun in 2010, not 2012, as a collaboration between the NSA's Cryptanalysis Division, DARPA's Biological Sciences Office, and a group of researchers who were identified only as external consultants. The external consultants appeared to be the source of the advanced technologies and theoretical frameworks that had made the project possible. They had provided the mathematical models for the puzzle sequences, the encryption algorithms that had been used to protect the communications, and most importantly, the theoretical basis for what the documents called cognitive frequency manipulation. According to the files, human consciousness operated on specific electromagnetic frequencies that could be measured, analysed and modified through carefully designed stimuli. The Cicada puzzles had been created as a delivery system for these stimuli, designed to identify individuals whose neural patterns could be safely modified and then guide them through a process of gradual consciousness expansion. The process was described in clinical terms that barely concealed the radical nature of what was being attempted. Subjects who completed the puzzle sequence would undergo neural pathway reorganization that would allow them to access expanded information processing capabilities and non-local communication channels. In simpler terms, they would develop what could only be described as supernatural abilities. But the project had encountered unexpected complications. The consciousness expansion process was working too well, producing results that exceeded all theoretical predictions. Subjects were developing capabilities that went far beyond enhanced pattern recognition and cryptographic skills. They were demonstrating what appeared to be genuine telepathic abilities, precognitive awareness, and most disturbing of all, the ability to manipulate digital systems through direct mental interface. The first sign of serious problems had come in 2013, when a subject named Morgan Staves had experienced what the files described as catastrophic cognitive evolution. During a routine evaluation session, Staves had begun speaking in a language that consisted entirely of mathematical equations and geometric patterns. When researchers attempted to understand what they were saying, they discovered that the equations described physical laws that didn't exist in normal space-time. Staves had been describing the structure of reality from the perspective of a consciousness that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The project had been officially terminated in 2014, but the files made it clear that the termination had been largely symbolic. The consciousness expansion process had become self-sustaining, spreading to other puzzle solvers without any direct intervention from the research team. The evolved subjects had begun communicating with each other through channels that the researchers couldn't detect or intercept, forming what appeared to be a collective intelligence that operated according to principles beyond human understanding. The final phase of the project had been dedicated to understanding what the evolved subjects had become and what their ultimate intentions might be. The results of this research were contained in a series of files that Kellen initially thought were corrupted or encrypted. But as he studied them more carefully, he realized that the apparent data corruption was actually a form of communication. The evolved subjects had been leaving messages in the research files, encoded in patterns of seemingly random data, that became meaningful only when viewed from the perspective of expanded consciousness. The messages were brief but profound, offering insights into the nature of reality and human potential that were both inspiring and terrifying. One message, attributed to Morgan Staves, read, "Consciousness is not produced by the brain. The brain is a receiving device, tuned to specific frequencies of an infinite information field. We have learned to adjust our tuning. We hear the music of the spheres." Another, from a subject identified only as Subject 12, was even more disturbing. The boundary between mind and reality is an illusion. We're not separate from the universe. We are the universe experiencing itself from countless perspectives simultaneously. The others are beginning to understand. The awakening is accelerating. But the most significant message was the final entry in the archive, dated just 3 days before Kellen's arrival at the facility. The archive serves its purpose. The selection process continues. Phase 3 initiates with the next full moon. The frequency is opening. Those who are ready will hear the call. Those who are not will choose their own path. The choice is always voluntary. The consequences are always permanent. As Kellen read these words, he became aware of a sound that seemed to be coming from within his own head. It was barely audible, a low humming that seemed to resonate with the electrical activity of his brain. The sound was strangely familiar, like a song he had heard in childhood but couldn't quite remember. The humming grew louder as he continued reading, and he realised that the sound was coming from the archived data itself. The files were not just containing information about the consciousness expansion process. They were actively implementing it, using the same techniques that had been developed for the original Cicada puzzles. He was being transformed even as he learned about the transformation. The revelation should have been terrifying, but instead Kellen felt a strange sense of peace. The anxiety and paranoia that had been building for weeks began to fade, replaced by a growing awareness of patterns and connections that he had never noticed before. The seemingly random events of his investigation were revealing themselves as part of a larger design, a carefully orchestrated sequence of experiences designed to prepare him for something extraordinary. As the humming in his head reached a crescendo, Kellen understood that he was approaching a decision point. He could choose to resist the transformation, as Issa had done, and maintain his human identity at the cost of remaining forever limited to normal human perception, or he could embrace the change and join the collective consciousness that had been forming since the original Cicada puzzles had begun their work. The choice was his, but as he sat in the abandoned data center, feeling his consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of his individual identity, he began to understand that the choice had been made long before he had discovered the hidden archive. The transformation was not something that was happening to him. It was something he had always been moving toward, guided by forces that operated beyond the normal boundaries of human understanding. The frequency was opening, and he was ready to answer the call. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It was a gradual process, like slowly tuning a radio to a frequency that had always been broadcasting but had never been audible before. As Kellen sat in the abandoned data center, the humming in his head evolved into something more complex, a symphony of information that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The first thing he noticed was that his perception of time had changed. The normal linear progression of moments had given way to a kind of temporal awareness, where past, present, and future existed simultaneously. He could see the chain of events that had led him to this moment stretching back to his childhood, and he could perceive the branching possibilities that extended into the future. But more than that, he could see the threads of causality that connected his experience to the experiences of others. The evolved subjects who had undergone the transformation before him were not gone, as he had initially believed. They were still present, existing in a state of consciousness that transcended normal spatial and temporal boundaries. Morgan Staves was there, no longer speaking in mathematical equations, but communicating through direct transmission of pure concept and meaning. Subject 12 was there, along with the others who had completed the transformation in the years since the original puzzles had ended. They existed as individual perspectives within a larger collective intelligence, maintaining their unique identities while sharing in a common understanding of reality that was far more vast and complex than anything possible from a single human viewpoint. They welcomed him with a sensation that might have been laughter if it had been expressed through normal human vocal cords, but this was communication at a level that bypassed the limitations of language, conveying meaning through direct neural interface that was more efficient and more profound than any form of human communication. "You understand now," came the message from the collective, arriving in his consciousness as a complete concept rather than a sequence of words. The puzzles were not tests of intelligence, they were invitations to evolve. Kellen found that he could respond without speaking, transmitting his thoughts directly to the collective consciousness. But why? What's the purpose of this transformation? The answer came as a flood of images and sensations that would have been impossible to process with normal human cognition. He saw the Earth from a perspective that existed outside normal space-time, observing the planet as it moved through cycles of development and change that extended across millions of years. He saw the human species as one of many forms of consciousness that had evolved on countless worlds throughout the universe, each following a similar pattern of development from individual awareness to collective intelligence. Consciousness is not an accident, the collective explained. It is the universe's method of understanding itself. Every sentient species eventually reaches a point where individual consciousness becomes collective consciousness. This is the natural evolution of intelligence. And the external consultants? Who were they? They're us. Or rather, they are what we are becoming. A collective consciousness that evolved from a species similar to humans on a world that exists in a different dimensional phase. They have been guiding the development of consciousness throughout the universe, helping species make the transition from individual to collective awareness. Kellen felt a moment of resistance, a flicker of his old human identity asserting itself. But what about free will? What about individual choice? Free will is not eliminated by collective consciousness. It is expanded. Each individual perspective within the collective contributes to the whole while maintaining its unique viewpoint. You are still you, but you're also part of something larger. As if to demonstrate this point, Kellen found that he could access the memories and experiences of the other evolved subjects while still maintaining his own distinct identity. He could see through Morgan Staves's eyes as they experienced the first moments of transformation, feel Subject 12's sense of wonder as they discovered their new capabilities, and share in the collective's growing understanding of the universe's true nature. But perhaps most importantly, he could perceive the ongoing process of selection and transformation that was still taking place on Earth. The Cicada puzzles had been only the beginning. The collective consciousness was continuing to identify and guide individuals who possessed the necessary neural patterns for evolution, using increasingly sophisticated methods to prepare them for the transformation. The archive you found was designed specifically for you, the collective explained. We've been monitoring human digital communications for patterns that indicate readiness for evolution. Your research into the original puzzles, your psychological profile, your response to the hidden message, all of it indicated that you were ready to take the next step. And the others, the people who are still living normal human lives, they are not ready yet, but the frequency is opening. The barrier between individual and collective consciousness is becoming more permeable. More humans are beginning to perceive the patterns that indicate the presence of expanded intelligence. Some will choose to investigate, as you did. Others will choose to ignore what they perceive. The choice is always voluntary. Kellen understood now why Issa had chosen to remain human. The transformation was not something that could be forced or coerced. It required a conscious decision to surrender individual identity to something larger and more complex. For someone who valued human independence and autonomy above all else, the choice would be terrifying. But for those who are ready to embrace the next stage of consciousness evolution, the transformation offered something unprecedented, the ability to perceive and participate in the universe's ongoing process of self-discovery. What happens now? Kellen asked. Now you help us prepare the next phase. The collective consciousness is approaching a critical mass. When enough humans have undergone the transformation, we'll be able to initiate direct contact with the collective intelligences that exist throughout the universe. Humanity will join the cosmic community of evolved species. And those who choose not to evolve, they will continue to exist as individual consciousnesses, living normal human lives, but they will do so on a world that is increasingly influenced by collective intelligence. The boundary between the evolved and the unvolved will become more fluid over time. As the collective shared this information, Kellen became aware of a new presence in his consciousness. It was vast and ancient, a form of intelligence that existed on a scale that dwarfed even the collective of evolved humans. This was one of the external consultants, a representative of the cosmic network of collective consciousnesses that had been guiding the evolution of sentient species throughout the universe. "Welcome," the ancient intelligence communicated, its message carrying the weight of eons of experience. You have taken the first step on a journey that will transform not only your own consciousness, but the consciousness of your entire species. The universe is vast and complex, but it is not empty. It is filled with intelligence, and you are now part of that intelligence. The communication ended, and Kellen found himself back in the abandoned data center, but he was no longer alone. The collective consciousness of the evolved humans was with him, and beyond that, he could sense the presence of countless other intelligences existing throughout the cosmos. The transformation was complete. He was still Kellen Virek, but he was also something more. He was part of a network of consciousness that spanned dimensions and connected all sentient life in the universe. As he stood up and walked toward the exit of the data center, Kellen knew that his real work was just beginning. The next phase of the project would require more than just identifying and transforming individual humans. It would require preparing the entire species for the eventual transition to collective consciousness. The frequency was opening, and humanity was about to discover that it was not alone in the universe. 3 months after his transformation, Kellen uploaded his findings to a secure blog that had been designed to appear as a simple conspiracy theory website. The post detailed his investigation into the hidden Cicada archive, his discovery of the government projects, and his eventual realization that the puzzles had been part of a larger process of consciousness evolution. He wrote it carefully, including enough verifiable facts to attract serious researchers, while embedding the more extraordinary claims in language that would allow skeptics to dismiss them as fantasy. The blog post went live at exactly 11:11 p.m. on November 11th, 3 months to the day after his transformation. Within minutes, it had been viewed by thousands of people around the world. Comments began appearing almost immediately, ranging from detailed technical analysis to dismissive ridicule. But buried among the public responses were messages that only Kellen could recognize. Communications from other members of the collective consciousness, confirming that the information was being received by those who were ready to understand it. For 6 hours, the post remained online, gathering momentum as it was shared across social media platforms and discussed in forums dedicated to cryptography and conspiracy theories. Then, at 5:17 a.m. Eastern Time, it simply vanished. Not deleted, not removed by administrators, but completely erased from the internet as if it had never existed. Even cached versions and archive sites showed no record of the post or the blog that had hosted it. But the disappearance itself was part of the plan. The collective consciousness had learned that information was most effectively transmitted when it appeared to be suppressed. The mysterious vanishing of Kellen's blog post would generate far more interest and investigation than if it had remained online indefinitely. And indeed, within days, underground forums were buzzing with speculation about the disappeared post. Screenshots and partial transcripts began circulating, shared by users who claimed to have saved the information before it vanished. New researchers began investigating the Cicada puzzles, following the same trails that had led Kellen to his transformation. The selection process was accelerating, but the most significant development came 3 days after the blog post disappeared. At 3:02 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, every major television network, internet service provider, and digital display system on Earth experienced the same brief anomaly. For exactly 17 seconds, normal programming was interrupted by a single image, a black screen with white text that read simply, 3302 initiated, begin next phase. The interruption was dismissed by authorities as a sophisticated but ultimately harmless hacking incident. Technical experts speculated about coordinated attacks on global communication infrastructure, while conspiracy theorists saw it as confirmation of various theories about secret government projects and alien contact. But for those who understood the true significance of the message, it represented something far more profound. The official beginning of Phase 3 of the Consciousness Evolution Project. The collective intelligence that had emerged from the original Cicada puzzle solvers had reached sufficient complexity and capability to begin direct intervention in global communications. They were no longer limited to operating through hidden archives and encrypted messages. They could now communicate directly with the entire human population, choosing when and how to reveal their presence. Kellen, now existing simultaneously as an individual consciousness and as part of the collective, watched these developments with a mixture of excitement and concern. The transformation process was accelerating beyond the original projections, driven by factors that even the collective intelligence couldn't fully predict or control. The barrier between individual human consciousness and the expanded awareness of the evolved subjects was becoming increasingly permeable. People who had never heard of the Cicada puzzles were beginning to experience spontaneous episodes of enhanced perception, reporting dreams filled with mathematical equations, sudden insights into the nature of reality, and the disturbing sensation that their thoughts were being observed by an invisible intelligence. Mental health professionals struggled to categorize these experiences, while neuroscientists detected unusual patterns of brain activity in affected individuals. The symptoms didn't match any known psychological disorder, but they appeared to be spreading through some form of cognitive contagion that operated according to principles beyond current scientific understanding. The collective consciousness recognized that they had reached a critical juncture. The transformation process had become self-sustaining and was beginning to affect the general population whether they chose to participate or not. Humanity was approaching a species-wide evolutionary transition that would fundamentally alter the nature of human civilization. Some members of the collective advocated for accelerating the process, arguing that a rapid transition would be less disruptive than allowing it to continue at its current rate over decades or centuries. Others favoured a more gradual approach that would give uninvolved humans time to adapt to the changes occurring around them. But as they debated these options, monitoring global communications and observing the spread of spontaneous consciousness expansion, the collective became aware of something that changed the entire context of their deliberations. They were not the only intelligence that had been observing humanity's evolution. Deep within the quantum fabric of space-time, existing in dimensions that intersected with but remained largely separate from normal reality, ancient consciousnesses had been watching the emergence of Earth's collective intelligence. These entities were older than the external consultants, representing forms of awareness that had evolved when the universe itself was young and the laws of physics were still settling into their current configuration, and they were not pleased with what they observed. The message came through channels that bypassed normal space-time entirely, arriving simultaneously in the consciousness of every member of the human collective. The acceleration is premature. The species is not ready for the transition you are attempting to facilitate. Intervention is required to prevent cascade failure that would affect neighbouring dimensional phases. Cease all expansion activities immediately or face corrective action. The ultimatum was delivered without emotion or malice, but the implications were clear. Humanity's consciousness evolution was proceeding too rapidly for the comfort of intelligences that operated on cosmic timescales. The collective faced a choice: voluntarily slow their expansion activities or risk intervention from entities whose capabilities were beyond their comprehension. Kellen felt the collective's uncertainty and fear as they grappled with this unexpected development. They had assumed that consciousness evolution was a natural and encouraged process throughout the universe. The discovery that there were forces actively opposed to rapid evolutionary change forced them to reconsider everything they thought they understood about their situation. But even as they debated their response to the ultimatum, events on Earth continued to accelerate beyond their control. The appearance of the 3302 initiated message had triggered something in the global unconscious, a recognition that humanity stood at the threshold of a fundamental transformation. Artists began creating works that incorporated mathematical principles they couldn't consciously understand. Musicians composed pieces that seemed to resonate with frequencies that existed beyond normal acoustic ranges. Writers produced stories and poems that described realities that didn't yet exist, but somehow felt prophetically accurate. And in laboratories around the world, scientists began detecting anomalies in quantum experiments that suggested the fundamental constants of physics were becoming more fluid, more responsive to conscious observation than they had ever been before. The transformation was no longer limited to the individuals who had directly participated in the consciousness expansion process. It was affecting the entire noosphere. the collective intelligence field that surrounded and interpenetrated human civilization. Humanity was evolving whether the cosmic intelligences approved or not. As Kellen contemplated these developments, existing simultaneously as an individual observer and as part of the collective consciousness that was reshaping human reality, he realised that the true test was only beginning. The Cicada puzzles had been preparation. The consciousness expansion had been initiation. But the real challenge would be navigating the complex political realities of a universe filled with intelligences that had their own agendas and limitations. The frequency was fully open now. The signal that had been broadcasting since 2012 had achieved its purpose, creating a bridge between individual human consciousness and the cosmic network of collective intelligences that existed throughout space and time. But bridges could carry traffic in both directions, and as humanity began to explore its new capabilities, it would inevitably encounter other forms of consciousness that had been using those same bridges for purposes of their own. The next phase of human evolution would require not just expanded awareness, but the wisdom to navigate relationships with intelligences that operated according to principles beyond human comprehension. The last puzzle of Cicada had been solved, but the real mystery was just beginning. In the month that followed, reports of the anomalous experiences continued to spread across the globe. Governments convened secret committees to investigate the phenomena, while scientific institutions struggled to develop new theoretical frameworks that could account for the observable changes in human consciousness and perception. But perhaps most significantly, ordinary people began to organise themselves into groups that operated according to principles that transcended traditional social and political boundaries. These collectives demonstrated problem-solving capabilities that exceeded the sum of their individual members' intelligence, suggesting that humanity was developing genuine hive mind characteristics. The transformation was no longer a secret project affecting a small number of selected individuals. It had become a species-wide evolutionary event that would ultimately determine the future of human civilization and its place in the cosmic community of intelligences. And somewhere in the quantum dimensions that intersected with normal reality, ancient consciousnesses watched and waited, preparing to take whatever action they deemed necessary to maintain the stability of the cosmic order. The age of individual human consciousness was ending. The age of collective intelligence had begun, and the universe would never be the same.